daughter was born on September 11th, 2017. After 26 hours of labor, she came into the world wide-eyed and calm at 1:48 a.m. And as we wrapped her up in all her newborn perfection and looked down at her, my husband and I wondered what we would tell her about the day she was born. We needed something to counter the obvious. That September 11th was one of the most tragic and shocking days in American history. And what we landed on was this. September 11th, we would tell her, is the day that heroes were born. Not all of them will be written about in the history books or even remembered, but on that day in 2001, hundreds of women and men put the lives of others above their own. And that's what a true hero is, isn't it? But the date still haunted me a bit, and it wasn't until a few months later when it was forever redeemed in my eyes. We had hired a babysitter who's from Ethiopia, and when I told her about the day of my daughter's birth, her eyes lit up and she said, "That's the Ethiopian New Year. It means the day of jewels. It's a very good day to be born." Before I became a mom, I spent the bulk of my career working in public relations on Capitol Hill and for 2 international humanitarian nonprofits. And after a decade of having the 24/7 news cycle dictate my entire professional life, I needed a break. So for the first month or so of maternity leave, I checked out of the news completely. When I checked back in to the happenings of our world, it was the rise of the Me Too movement, and Harvey Weinstein ruled the front pages. And while I was cheering that these injustices were being brought into the light, as I looked down at my tiny daughter in my arms, I couldn't help but think that these weren't the stories I wanted her to grow up on. So I was moved by love for my daughter to do something about it, and I set out to create a magazine that would elevate hidden heroes, encourage hearts, and inspire impact, with the hope that the stories we would tell would inspire my children and others to live a life of meaning. The author and theologian G.K. Chesterton is often quoted as writing, "Fairy tales don't tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed." The stories we encounter on a daily basis would have us believe we live in a bad world, constantly pointing to all the dragons that exist. Dragons like disease and depression, gun violence and genocide, homicide, homelessness, racism, the refugee crisis, all types of abuses, and any number of political scandals, humanitarian crises, or natural disasters. But as Helen Keller said, although the world is full of suffering, it's also full of the overcoming of it. So while it's important to leverage the pen as a tool for accountability and to be informed so we can be active and engaged citizens, I'd argue what's missing most from our media consumption habits aren't stories of all the dragons and the ways in which we might, could, should kill them, but stories of the dragon slayers and the way that they live their lives. The stories that tell us that dragons can be killed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The stories of the overcoming of the suffering. Why? Well, we tend to imitate the protagonists in the stories we hear. This is why there's copycats after horrific crimes, or why young teenage girls and boys are constantly checking themselves against everything they see in the social media feeds of their favorite influencers. A Michigan State University study found that even babies as young as 14 months of age will copy what they see on TV. We all know the expression, "you are what you eat," but I found increasingly we are what we read and scroll past and click on. And study after study has found the negative effects of excessive news consumption on our daily lives, from spikes in anxiety and depression to feelings of hopelessness and despair in the midst of a world on fire. The stories we allow into our bodies and minds and souls affect our reality, for better or for worse. On September 11th, 2016, exactly 1 year before my daughter's birth, I was on a plane to Cambodia to help a journalist tell a story of great hope born out of a place of great depravity. As a PR rep for the world's largest international anti-slavery organization, it was my job to see that this story see the light of day. a story of how the nation of Cambodia, a place once teeming with very small children for sale, attracting Johns and pedophiles from across the globe, was now actively combating the crime of sex trafficking of children. Why? The collective efforts of everyday heroes. The police officer who refused to take that bribe from a brothel owner. The young man who was working as a DJ in a club and later became the country's top prosecutor of the crime. The politician who fought for her country's dignity when it wasn't popular or even safe. But before even finding one reporter who would tell this story, I pitched media outlet after media outlet, only to find that no one really wants to tell the hero's tale. Not unless there's some element of tragedy or sensationalism involved. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. So why is that? Psychologists call it the negativity bias, or our brain's natural inclination towards all things bad. So like unhealthy diets full of sugar and fat, negative news featuring bad actors has us coming back for more. But I think that we're all craving a healthy serving of hope to keep us moving forward. In fact, a study published just last month by the National Academy of Sciences found that 2 out of 5 people globally across 17 countries and 6 continents either didn't have a negativity bias or actually had a bias towards positive news. And in recent years, we have seen an uptick in positive news, solutions-based reporting featuring statistics that counter a narrative of doom and gloom. But we're not frequently inspired by statistics. We're inspired by other people and the way that they live their lives. This is why we love biographies or Q&As that expose the daily habits of the people we admire most. We need to tell stories of heroes again, of people living lives worth imitating, not because of how many followers they have or how much money they make, but because of what they do for others. And in my work, I have seen hero after hero after hero. People I want to model my life after, people I want my children to look to as they grow up and decide who they will be. People like Sarah, who together with her dad has built a business creating these beautiful backyard tables for the sole purpose of bringing communities together, fighting loneliness and disconnect one meal at a time. Or Patrick, a Ugandan hospital administrator who has ensured the top quality health care for thousands in his country, even for the very poor, especially for the very poor. Or Ashley, who tragically lost her young daughter to a rare disease at just 21 months of age, and has since started a nonprofit that offers free portrait sessions to families facing a terminal diagnosis, re-entering back into her grief day in and day out for the good of others. You know, I don't know where we'll be 10, 20, 50 years in the future if we keep up our present media diet, but I often wonder this. What if we exchanged some of the headlines of the day for stories that foster a sense of hope and heroism? What if you opened a magazine or turned on the TV not to barking pundits or celebrity scandal, but to stories of lives well lived? Because if we're to be truly empowered by our media to live meaningful lives, it isn't enough to be horrified or guilted or disgusted. We must be encouraged. And it isn't enough to be left in despair, because that leads to discouragement and compassion fatigue. It isn't enough to be informed. We must be inspired. And I do think there's hope for the media we consume and the stories we tell, but we must demand it. We must pay for and read and click on stories that reflect beauty and goodness in the world. In the early 1800s, the poet William Blake wrote these words, "We become what we behold." And I think he's absolutely right. So let's tell more stories from a world of good, of acts of heroism, big and small. Let's be inspired by the media we consume. And then let's go live lives in noble pursuit.